My name is Mike Parker. Welcome to the Church History Survey class. You should all have a copy of the Church History Survey course syllabus, which I'm looking at right now. There are going to be three major sources of things that you're going to be looking at, that is, you're going to be reading. The first and the most important are the online materials, which originally were my lecture notes, which I've reduced to writing. They're the core of the class, and most of the questions and themes and ideas and emphases of the class will be drawn from that material. However, I would also like you to read the two books that are in the course requirements, Richard J. Plantinga et al., An Introduction to Christian Theology, is the second major source for this class. It's going to cover some of the material that I'm looking at in that you will be looking at in the online course material in a slightly different way. It's going to be focusing on the great theologians and the great ideas of church history. I will touch on most of them, but I won't be able to give many of them the in-depth quality that they really deserve. So I'm inviting you then to spend some time with Plantinga's work as a major supplement to this course material. The other book I'd like you to look at is Earl E. Kearns' Christianity Through the Centuries, A History of the Christian Church. This is a survey of church history. It's similar to the survey that I'm giving you. But remember that the online material were originally lecture notes. So I'm highlighting certain things and I'm ignoring other things. But in this book, you're getting a little bit of everything. You're getting a true survey. So you need both things. You need to be paying attention to the online material to see what I think is important, to see what I'm highlighting, the ideas and the people and so forth. But this other book will give you a more general survey of the church. So between these three voices, the voice of Plantinga and Kearns and myself, I think you'll get an excellent introduction to church history. We are going to be doing in this course something that I've never attempted before, and that is to try to teach all of church history in a single semester. This is going to require a great deal from you in terms of doing the reading, doing it on time, and attempting to really understand it and grapple with the people and the ideas. I don't expect you in this class to memorize lots of dates and to memorize every little bit of detail that you're going to be encountering in these readings. Rather, what I'd like you to do is, as I've tried to do in the online material, is to focus on the highlights. What are the great themes of church history that you're seeing in this material? Who are the key leaders, the key intellectuals that are being highlighted? What are the key ideas or the theological themes that emerge from this material? If you can understand those things, I think by the end of this course, you'll have an excellent overview of church history. And that's what I would like to give you for this semester. The semester is broken up into 12 weeks. The first 5 weeks of the course will focus on the period from the very beginnings of the origins of Christianity through the first phase of the Reformation, that is the life of Martin Luther and a little bit of Ulrich Zwingli. So that's the bulk of church history. We're going to be doing it in 5 sessions. That gives you a good sense of how quickly we're going to be covering this material. The 6th week, we will give you a midterm examination. And the following 6 weeks then will be the rest of Reformation history and modern church history. And this will be concluded then with a final exam. So that being said, that being the organization for the class, let's talk about the first week. In the first week, we will be asking you to read units 1 through 6 on the online material and the accompanying readings from Plantinga and Kearns. These first 6 units are concerned principally with the first 200 years of church history. The first unit is simply introductory. It's posing the questions of why we should even study history. What is it that you expect to get out of a church history class? What's the takeaway? So it will be asking you to think about those things. Unit 2 and 3 will give you some of the background of church history. Jesus came into the world at a very specific moment, at a specific time in the history of the Roman Empire and of the Jewish people. He's living in that context, and the church emerges out of that context. So church history then, the origins of church history can't really be understood without understanding the context in which Jesus and the early leaders of the church, the disciples, the apostles, are in. So we'll look then at the history briefly of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, or Rome as a republic, begins about 500 years before Jesus is born, and it continues for about another 500 years after his death. It was an empire that lasted for 1,000 years, and Jesus occupies that center moment in the history of Rome as an empire. And he lives in that period, and the church emerges in that period, which is considered the golden age of Rome, the period from 27 BC until 180 AD. This is the great age of Rome. It was, the Apostle Paul put it this way, that Jesus came in the fullness of time. And in many ways, I think, as we look at the history of Rome, we see that he meant that in a very specific way, that Jesus came at a golden moment in the history of Rome when the gospel could be quickly and easily disseminated in the world. The other thing that's interesting about this Roman era in which Jesus appears, and Paul and the other disciples, is that it was intellectually and religiously, it was a moment of crisis. The Roman Empire was a universal empire, but it was made up of a number of local nations or regional groups or even city-states, each of them having their own local gods. And those local gods, in the midst of a universal empire, no longer made sense. People were yearning for something more. They were yearning for a universal God. They were moving toward, step by step, moving toward a belief in monotheism. And so the old traditions no longer made sense. People were beginning to look for something new, and Christianity became one of those new things, one of those new possibilities in this period. But there were actually many different possibilities. The Romans were considering many different religious possibilities that were coming in from the East. And these were referred to as mystery religions because they had certain mysterious aspects in common. Christianity can be considered to be one of these mystery religions. So the question we need to ask, and as budding historians, is why does Christianity succeed and all of these others fail? Why does Christianity become the favorite and then the official religion of the Roman Empire? In Unit 3, we'll look at the Jewish background. We need to think of Christianity in its first century as a Jewish sect. We think of it today as the Christian religion, but in its own day, in its origins, it was part of the Jewish religion. And the early Christians thought of themselves as Jews who happened to be Christians. There's going to be a transition period when that's no longer the case, and they simply become Christians without that Jewish background. Nevertheless, they emerge from a Jewish background, and the Jewish background will always, even to this day, inform much of the nature of Christianity. Another aspect of this Jewish background that's important to the growth and development of the early church is the Jewish diaspora. As much as 500 years before the birth of Jesus, the Jewish people began to leave Israel and to move out into other parts of the world. There were Jewish people in all the major cities of the ancient Mediterranean world or region. And these are the places that Paul went to and other disciples went to initially as they were attempting to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ. So the Jewish diaspora then becomes the thing on which the thing on which Christianity will, the thing that Christianity will use initially to spread its message in the ancient world. Another aspect of this, yet one more aspect of this Jewish background, is the fact that it was becoming Greek. As much as 250 years before the birth of Jesus, the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, was translated into Greek. And that Greek Bible became available all throughout the ancient world. And it was the Bible that the early disciples used. And so part of this emergence of the church is that it will emerge, yes, with a Jewish background, but increasingly it's a Jewish background that's engaging with a Hellenistic or Greek world and environment. One of the great accomplishments of this early period of church history, certainly in the first century, is the gathering of the literature that will become the New Testament. The other thing that it does is that it begins to produce a church, that is an institution, with institutional leaders. It begins, and now we're moving on to Unit 4, it begins with apostles, prophets, and teachers, and in a lesser role, we see, even as early as the writings in the New Testament, we see bishops, presbyters, and deacons. But it's these latter three, who were not particularly important in the first several centuries, who become the key players in the second, third century and following. How does that transition from one kind of leadership to another kind of leadership take place? And why does it take place? This is what we'll be looking at in Unit 4. Also in Unit 4, we're going to be asking a question. How can a Jewish faith, in this case Christianity, be made understandable and appealing in a Greco-Roman world? The Greco-Roman people were a pluralistic people. They were proud of their own local traditions. And here was a Hebrew religion coming on the scene, making its appeal as a universal religion. But why should people pay attention to that? Why should they give any heed to this Jewish religion? So in addition to the institutional leaders that we see in the early church, we also see a number of intellectual leaders who will help the church make its case to the non-Jewish people for the reality of Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. And these people are called apologists. An apologist is not someone who apologizes. He's someone who explains. The apologists were the early intellectual leaders of the church who were explaining and defending the new church. Not so much for the Jewish people, but for the Greek people. So in other words, what's happening here is an intellectual transition and a translation that's taking place. The Christian religion, initially in its Jewish phase and in its Jewish language, is being translated into the culture, into the ideas, the thought forms of the Hellenistic world. And this is the role then of the apologist. One of the key apologists, and one that I'm highlighting in the online material, is Justin Martyr, because he makes a very unique contribution. He says that the Greco-Roman world that produced such wonderful philosophers was a world that was left unfulfilled, and it's Christianity that will fulfill it. So we see, for example, in writers like Plato and Aristotle, a yearning for moral truth, a yearning to discover the rationality that exists in the universe. Plato and Aristotle both argue themselves into a belief in monotheism, but they had nowhere to go with this without a revelation. And so Justin Martyr will argue that Christianity then is the fulfillment of the best of this Greek thought that we see in Plato and Aristotle and others. In the fifth unit, we ask a different sort of question. In the fourth unit, we looked at how and why the church ideas, Christian ideas, were translated from a Hebrew culture into the Greek culture. In the fifth unit, we ask, was this always a good thing? And in fact, Tertullian asked the famous question, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? Which is another way of saying that the truths of Christianity in its Hebrew context made sense. But as they are translated into a Greek context, they produce a number of heresies. They tend to mislead people. So there's always a danger in making a kind of intellectual or cultural translation, which is what we're seeing in this second century and following in church history. So we see then in the second century the rise of a number of heresies, of Gnosticism, of Marcionism, and Montanism. Those are the three that we're going to highlight in the notes and that you'll see in the other texts. And then finally, in Unit 6, what is the Church's response to these various heresies? I'm going to argue that there are three essential responses. The first is that the Church attempted to strengthen the position of the bishop as an authority. And so we see that in the early second century, the development of the doctrine of apostolic succession. Secondly, we see that the Church begins to define its theology over and against these new heresies that are arising. And so we see in this same period the formation of the Apostles' Creed. And then finally we see, at least in the beginning way in the second century, the emergence of a Christian canon, the canon that will become the New Testament. This is not finalized until toward the end of the 4th century. But even as early as the 2nd century, we see the Church beginning to gather the essential materials that it will need to create the New Testament and to exclude those materials which it feels are inappropriate or even heretical. So there you have it. Those are the first 6 units of church history that we will be looking at together. Thank you for your time.